I want you to know, Carolyn, that when you brought up the prayer request for little Charlie Skaggs, my first reaction was, well, I know he's lost a lot of weight, but I don't know that I'm ready to call him little yet. But then I remembered, there's another littler Charlie Skaggs. When he was 7 years old, his family was evicted from their home and he had to go to work to pay for the bills. When he was 9 years old, his mother died. He had less than 1 year of formal education his entire life. When he was 23 years old, he lost his job, so he thought he would run for the state legislature. He lost, so he bought a store with a business partner. The business failed, and his partner died, leaving him with all the bills. When he was 26, his sweetheart died. He had a complete nervous breakdown the next year. He ran for Congress 3 times and was defeated the first 2. He was finally elected at age 37, but was defeated after only 1 term. At age 41, his son died. He ran for the U.S. Senate twice and was defeated both times. At age 47, he was nominated for vice president, but lost. Who was this lifelong loser? Abraham Lincoln. Turn, if you will, to Genesis chapter 41. I love it when we begin the chapter with when, because that makes you look back and say, okay, what's going on now? 2 full years had passed. Well, 2 full years, what? Where? Whom? Who's our intrepid hero? Joseph. Where is Joseph when we left him? In jail. Okay? Joseph, as we come to find out, has been in Egypt for right around 14 years by this time, as a servant in Potiphar's house, then for a while in jail. Now, after the incident where he interpreted dreams for 2 of Pharaoh's high-ranking officials, do you remember that? One lived, the other died, and he told the one that lived, remember me, help get me out of here. And as we closed chapter 40, what were the last words you heard? Well, he forgot him. So we take up the story 2 years later. Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat. Now, probably didn't mean anything to you when you first read this, but a cow was a prominent figure in the religious life of the Egyptians because that was the symbol for Isis, who was the goddess of the earth. Not their main god, but one of their main gods, a goddess. So it would have been significant to him that these were cows. They were nice and fat, and they grazed along the reeds. And after them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, skinny cows, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. Well, I guess so. What an odd dream. Well, he fell back to sleep. He had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Anybody here ever have dreams quite that vivid? It's kind of funny because I see some nods. Phil May just slays me because he'll come in. I don't know why I end up in his dreams so often, but he has to tell me I'm in his dreams, you know. It's usually doing something evil, I think. But he dreams in color. I mean, he can remember what the colors were, and he remembers them very vividly. I don't. I just don't have that experience. But as you can imagine, when you have a dream that's that vivid, and frankly, that kind of odd, I mean, come on, skinny cows eating fat cows, you've got to be alarmed. And so when Pharaoh woke up, we know that he was really alarmed because it said in the morning his mind was troubled. So what did he do? He sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Now, that would have been a pretty large group, I'm thinking. But he invited in the magi, those who were sorcerer-type people, and the wisest men, the men who gave him the wisest counsel in all of the country, and he gathered them all up for a big summit. He told them his dreams. And here's what's instructive. Here's what's kind of fascinating. No one could interpret them. Now, I'm telling you, God had his hand in this already. Because believe me, if the king summons in his toadies and his sycophants, and they're all around him wanting to please him, somebody's going to come up with an interpretation for that dream. But I'm telling you, God hushed him up. Nobody had anything to say about the dream. Then the chief cupbearer, does that sound familiar? Is that one where you hear the cupbearer and you go, oh man, you can just see him in the meeting going, oh good grief, I remembered this guy, this dude I met in jail 2 years ago. He said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Can anybody say amen? He's got to slap his head and say, oh man, I know, this guy's interpreted dreams for us. They came true, just like he said they would. I was supposed to remember them. I was so excited to still have my head attached to my neck that I just forgot all about this. So it's my shortcoming, my bad, Pharaoh. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. That's not odd. But he said, get this, Pharaoh, it happened just like he said it was going to happen. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. So, kind of get the picture here. Pharaoh has surrounded himself with the wisest men in the country, asking for an interpretation for this dream, and nobody had anything to say but the cupbearer, who said, well, I know a guy you might call. In other words, Pharaoh knew a guy who knew a guy. So, what do you think Pharaoh did? He picked up the phone to the prison, and he said, let me speak to Joseph. He sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. Now, I want you to think about the next verses, because I don't know if it meant anything to you when you first read it. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. First, they didn't have shick in the prison. But second, he wouldn't have shaved anyway, likely. What we don't know, we tend to think of Jewish custom that a young man of that age would likely have had a full beard. However, he was not married. And so an unmarried young man of that time would probably have been clean-shaven, but he'd been in prison, so he couldn't shave. So I've heard all kinds of theological arguments about whether or not Joseph was dissing God by shaving his beard. And the fact was, no, in that society, he likely would have been clean-shaven anyway, but since he was in jail, he had to shave, get all cleaned up, splash on a little aftershave, change his clothes, and he was brought before Pharaoh. All of the Egyptians, by the way, did not shave, so that's why he had to make sure that he was shaven. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream. No one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, we're about to find out something else about the character of Joseph. We found that God is with him continually. God honors what he does. God blesses those who bless Joseph. And remember his response to Potiphar's wife when she said, come lie with me? He said, I can't do this thing because I cannot sin against God. He had his priorities right. Look what he says here. Joseph says, I can't do it. I'm sure that took guts to say after he'd just been hauled out of jail. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. I don't know if you thought of this when you first read that. Did that seem like an awfully bold statement? Let me tell you why you should think that. Because in their society, Pharaoh was considered God. So when Joseph was brought out and said, I want you to interpret a dream, he says, I can't do it, but God can do it. So what was he saying to Pharaoh? You ain't he. You're not God. But God can do it. There were times Pharaoh would have likely had his head removed from him for doing that, for his audacity. But he said, God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream. So immediately, rather than commenting on his little gaffe here, he says, okay, let me get to the story here. In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed along the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows, the story gets better, you've noticed here. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. So he's filling in a little of the details. He said, you would think that the skinny cows would get fat from eating the fat cows. He said, no. They ate up all the fat cows and they were still skinny and ugly. Then I woke up. In my dreams, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. Now, I want you to stop and think. I'm sure you've probably read something about the economy of Egypt, but at that time it was pretty well dependent on 2 things, livestock and its agriculture, which was exceedingly good for that part for northern Africa because of what? The Nile River and the river bottoms and the extremely fertile land around the Nile. And so the amount of food that they could produce from that part of the country was just mind-boggling. And yet here we had, in his visions, he had the 2 sources of his greatest wealth, livestock and grain. Well, the grain was growing on a single stalk, and after them 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the Shirako, by the east wind, the wind that blew predominantly and violently and hot out of the east. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none could explain it to me. So, Joseph, I can see him right now standing there scratching his chin, just thinking about what Pharaoh just told him. And he said something that was not too surprising. They're the same dream. They're the same dream. God's revealing something to you. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, you notice what he didn't say? He didn't say there's something that's going to happen to you. He said God's revealed something he's going to do. So Joseph wants to make sure that Pharaoh understands that the sequence of events that's about to unravel is of God's doing. God is setting the table here. Okay? The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the Shirako. There are 7 years of famine. It is just as I'd said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, let me tell you, I know that Pharaoh has probably spent a sleepless night, and you can see that his brow is likely furrowed as he sits and intently listens to what this young man is saying, but he's still blaspheming. But he said, God's about to do something. God's about to do something. Well, let me tell you, the courtiers around Pharaoh were probably recoiling in horror as he was speaking of God as being someone not only separate from Pharaoh, but superior to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh couldn't control what was about to happen because a God who was above him was about to make it happen. Please don't lose that fact. God has shown to you what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming through the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows will be so severe. In other words, we're going to have some really good years, but you know what? The following years are going to be so bad that they won't even remember the good years. I got to tell you, in 2011 and 2012, when there were 14 months when a drop of rain didn't fall on the Phelps farm down there, I scarcely remembered that in 2010 we got 12 inches of rain in one day. You tend to forget that when you're in the midst of a famine that there is no grass. You got to sell all your cattle. Cattlemen are going broke. You don't remember the good times in those times. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. In other words, this wasn't a passing fancy. God gave you a dream, and then He gave you a supporting dream, okay, to emphasize it. And He's saying, this is going to happen, and then He adds something else to the dream. He said, it's going to happen soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man. Let me stop right here. The impudence of this man never ceases. He's talking awful brave for a guy who's just out of jail. I mean, this is a parolee who's marched before God and is telling him what's going to happen. And then look what he says. He says, you better be looking for a manager. Pharaoh, I don't recall Pharaoh asking for his advice, in other words. He wanted him to interpret the dream. Pharaoh ought to be able to figure this out by himself, but this impudent young man, this whippersnapper, I don't care if he was well-built and handsome, okay, he was talking to Pharaoh and saying, you know what, bud, you need to look for a discerning and wise man. Put him in charge of Egypt. Well, what does that say about Pharaoh? He says, I want you to look for a wise man and put him in charge of Egypt. Pharaoh's got to be saying, well, what am I, chopped liver? Wait a minute, I thought I was a wise man and I was in charge of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. Now stop and think. He's not just interpreted the dream. He's told him that the famine was about to come, and then he told him what he should do in reaction to it. In other words, what he's saying is, here's God's plan. Here's what you need to be doing. Now, you need to find a wise man, not to figure out what we need to do, but to administer it. A wise man who can set up the infrastructure to store all of this kind of grain. Now, look what it says. The food should be held in reserve for the country to be used in the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt. And then look what he says, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. That's kind of a brilliant idea, to tell you the truth, because 7 years, you take 20% of the abundance that you're having because of the great harvest, and you just store it up. So that at the end of that time, you've got a pretty good stockpile of food. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials. That's kind of funny. If it seemed good to Pharaoh, you think it seemed good to all the officials? Yep. You bet. Because they're scared to death. They thought it was going to be off with their heads because they couldn't interpret the dream. But it seemed good to them. Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? That is what we call, folks, a rhetorical question. He knew darn good and well who the man was. But he wants to make sure he's speaking to all his toadies there, and he said, where can we find this man who's already given him the answer? And then he adds, look what he adds, in whom is the Spirit of God. A big move by Pharaoh to admit there is a God greater than he. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Good grief. Who is Joseph? He's an unwanted ethnic, for one thing. You could almost see him spitting when they said Hebrew because they've used it in the pejorative. This Hebrew, he's young, and he's been in jail for crying out loud. You know, he's a convicted felon. He can't even vote in the elections, you know. So here's this young man, and he says, okay, what am I going to do with you? I'm going to make you the prime minister, in essence. No one has more power other than he that sits on the throne, me. So he's second in command in all of Egypt, which at that particular point in history is the greatest nation in the world. So from jailbird, one day, to prime minister of the greatest nation on earth the next day. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Let me stop right here. Do you recall the story of when David was outfitting himself to go out and fight Goliath? And Saul was so relieved not to have the responsibility that he was putting his armor on David, which must have been kind of comical because it just swallowed him up. You know, it's like he was wearing his daddy's clothes. I get this picture here. You've still got this jailbird who still has razor burn. You know, when he's come out of prison, you know, he's probably got a cowlick all slicked down on the back, and he's a young guy, and so all of a sudden the wisest and most tenured members of his staff are being leapfrogged by a kid that's wet behind the ears. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. This was the sign of authority that they used when they sealed something that dripped wax, and they would actually use his ring. So Joseph had the full authority of the throne of Egypt. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, and he put a gold chain around his neck, all symbols of authority. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. If you're Joseph, stop and think what your head's got to be spinning right now. He's down there working in his prison ministry in a dungeon, and the next day people are shouting, "Make way for the prime minister!" And he's got a big gold chain around his neck. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or foot in all of Egypt." In other words, you have complete authority. He gave him the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. Now, I don't know if those names meant anything to you. Did you just go, that makes sense to me? Well, let me tell you what it did mean, is that it was a political alliance, alliance that was made through a marriage. On was not the most powerful god in Egypt. Ra and Isis were probably more prominent, but the priest of On was one of the most prominent men in all the country, and so he took his daughter, and said, "Joseph, here is your wife." As you might imagine, that was not born of romance, but it was politically expedient. So he handed him this woman and said, "Okay, we will weave you into the fabric of Egyptian life through a marriage." So he was given a wife, and Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. What do you think he did going throughout the land of Egypt? Setting up infrastructure, building silos, making county commissioners, if you will, setting up a system that would start collecting this grain, and whether or not he was popular didn't matter because he had the authority of the Pharaoh. So he went all over Egypt. He was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. He collected all of the food produced in 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. That is not exactly a true statement. It's just a little bit of exaggeration. Remember, because he'd already said 20%. But he collected 20% of all the grain and stored it in the cities. And in each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. In other words, they couldn't even count the amount of food that was being stacked up. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn, and pay attention here because we're putting a stake in the ground, so we'll know later. His firstborn was named Manasseh. And he said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Now, I know that you were probably a little uncomfortable when you heard that Pharaoh gave him a bride. What's the problem with that? Because unlike his father and his grandfather before him, he did not take a wife from his own people. He didn't have a choice. Remember, he didn't have a choice. This wife was given to him. And what was the problem with taking a wife from the pagan peoples? She might influence you, as, for example, did Solomon's wives, to turn from the one true God. But we're dealing with Joseph now. And although allow me a little eisegesis. I'm going to read something in the Scripture. It's not here, brother. Whoa. I'm going to read something in there that's not there. When he said, look, I'm going to let you have a wife from the land here, but you know what? You are going to be the one who influences her and not vice versa. Because we do know about Ephraim and Manasseh, for example, that they were followers of God. Okay, so don't get all upset about the fact that he took a wife who wasn't a Hebrew. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh from food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. Isn't that beautiful? This young man's 37 years old. He's in charge of the entire land of Egypt, and when people started crying out that they don't have any food, he said, I got a guy in place just for that. Go to Joseph. Now let me tell you what the Lord's doing here when the Holy Spirit inspired Moses to write all this down. He's placing more markers to kind of establish the start of the next story. So get ready for this. There's not just a famine in Egypt. There's a famine throughout all the known world. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the world. Remember me telling you about Abraham Lincoln? Loser, 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 Abraham Lincoln. Some people actually teach that the moral of this story is that if you remain faithful, that God's going to bless you materially and in this life. Not quite. Not quite. God's not necessarily going to jerk you up out of prison and make you prime minister. I want you to remember that. Here's what the moral of the story is that faithfulness during times of trial and tribulation will bring blessings. Not necessarily just to you, and not necessarily in this lifetime, but will certainly bring blessings. I found a little memoir that I just love to read to you because I just thought, wow, this fits. From a man named Doug Nichols of Bothell, Washington. He says, while I was serving in India in 1967, tuberculosis forced me into a sanitarium for several months. I didn't yet speak the language, but I tried to give Christian literature written in their language to the patients, doctors, and nurses. Everyone politely refused. I sensed many weren't happy about a rich American. To them, all Americans were rich. Being in a free government-run sanitarium, they didn't know I was just as broke as they were. The first few nights I woke up coughing. One night during a coughing spell, I saw one of the older and sicker patients across the aisle trying to get out of bed. He sat up on the edge of the bed and tried to stand, but in weakness he fell back exhausted. I heard him crying softly. The next morning I realized what he had been trying to do. He had been trying to get up to go to the bathroom. The stench in our ward was awful. Other patients yelled insults at him. Angry nurses moved him as they cleaned up the mess, and one even slapped him. And the old man just curled up into a ball and wept. The next night, I woke up again coughing, and I noticed him trying to stand again. Like the night before, he fell back exhausted. I didn't want to be involved, but I got up out of bed and went over to him, and when I touched his shoulder, his eyes opened wide with fear. I smiled and put my arms under him and picked him up. He didn't weigh anything due to his age and advanced tuberculosis. I carried him to the washroom, which was just a filthy small room with a hole in the floor. I stood behind him with my arms under his armpits as he took care of himself. And when he finished, I picked him up, cleaned him off, and took him back to his bed. When I laid him down, he kissed me on the cheek and said something I couldn't understand. The next morning, another patient woke me and handed me a steaming cup of tea. He motioned with his hands that he wanted a tract. As the sun rose, other patients approached and indicated they also wanted the booklets I had tried to give away before. And throughout the day, nurses, interns, and doctors asked for literature. Weeks later, an evangelist who spoke the language visited me, and as he talked to others, he discovered that several had put their trust in Christ as Savior as a result of reading the literature. What did it take to reach these people with the gospel? It wasn't health, the ability to speak their language, or a persuasive talk. I just took a trip to the bathroom. So here's what I hope we get out of this story. As God may place us in a dungeon, is there any guarantee we're going to end up being the prime minister? None whatsoever. But think of the people to whom Joseph ministered in the prison, because it tells us he did. Think of the people to whom we can minister during our times of trial. Do we do it because we'll receive a reward? No, we do it because someone else paid it forward for us. That's why we do it. And so when in times of tribulation, it might be instructive that we look not just our own circumstances, but how we can bless other people, knowing that God's going to honor that. Next week, the saga continues. Read chapter 42. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for your word. We thank you for the example of one who, when placed in very difficult circumstances, was true to you. We learn, Father, that you did lift him up. And we claim that same promise, Father, though it may not be in this life or this time. Thank you for these, Father, who come and study these words. Ask, Father, that you bless them, that their lives flower, and that we all see you through your word. Now, as we go our separate ways, help us to remember that we're people sharing Jesus, for we do it in the name of your Son. Amen.